The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Chapter 10. Back home again. That was Tom's great secret, the plan to return home with his brother pirates and attend their own funeral. They had paddled over to the town on Saturday and slept in the woods at the edge of the village. At daybreak on Sunday, they crept into the church and finished their sleeping in the gallery. At breakfast on Monday morning, Aunt Polly was very loving to Tom, but he was busy chattering away with Sid about the events of the day, and after a while, Aunt Polly broke in. "Tom, I don't say it wasn't a fine joke. To keep everybody suffering almost a week so you boys could have a good time. But it was a pity you were so hard-hearted as to let me suffer so. If you could come over to go to your own funeral, you could have come over and given me a hint some way that you weren't dead. I suppose if you really loved me, you would have wanted to do that." This made Tom feel guilty. He had actually come to tell Aunt Polly that he was all right. He had even written her a note telling her just that. But instead of owning up to the truth, Tom made up a story of a dream he had on Jackson's Island. And this is what he said. "I dreamed I was right here in this very room, Aunt Polly. Mrs. Harper was here too. The two of you were crying and saying how much you missed us. I think you were saying how even though we got into trouble, we were always kind-hearted boys." She's telling him how much she was hurt by the fact that he didn't come and tell her. Tom gave such a perfectly detailed description of that unhappy night that Aunt Polly was truly amazed. This dream seemed to convince her that Tom had a special gift. She was so pleased that she took a big red apple from the cupboard and gave it to him to eat on the way to school. What a hero Tom had become. He didn't go skipping and prancing, but he moved with a dignified swagger, as became a pirate who felt that the public eye was on him. And indeed, it was. Tom tried to ignore the looks and remarks as he passed people, but they were food and drink to him. He was enjoying every moment of it. Smaller boys flocked at his heels, and older boys were consumed with envy. They would have given anything to have his swarthy, suntanned skin and his sudden fame. At school, the children made such a fuss over Tom and Joe and gazed at them with such admiration that the two heroes quickly became stuck up. That means they think they're better than everybody else. They told and retold their adventures to eager listeners who wanted to hear the whole story over and over again. Tom decided that he could be independent of Becky Thatcher now. His fame and glory were enough. He would live for that alone. Now that he was so distinguished, maybe she would want to make up. Well, let her. He decided she could try all she wanted. When Becky arrived at school, Tom pretended not to see her. He moved away and joined a group of boys and girls and began to talk. Soon he noticed that Becky was trying to catch his attention, going back and forth. Her face was flushed and her eyes were dancing. She pretended to be busy chasing schoolmates and screaming with laughter. When Tom pretended not to see her at all, Becky came closer and once or twice glanced toward him. Soon she noticed that Tom was talking more to Amy Lawrence than to anyone else. "Oh my, I think this maybe is going to cause trouble. What do you think?" She felt a sharp pang and grew disturbed and uneasy. In a moment of anger and jealousy, Becky announced that she was planning a party during the vacation. Soon everyone was begging for invitations. Everyone, that is, except Tom and Amy. Tom just turned coldly away and took Amy with him. Okay. Here's the picture. And I think this is probably Becky. And the girl with the long braid down her back is probably Amy that Tom has suddenly decided to pay attention to again. Becky doesn't look too happy, does she? Becky's lips trembled and tears came to her eyes. She hid these signs and went on talking. As soon as she could, she sneaked away by herself and burst into tears. She'd think of some way to get even with Tom Sawyer. At recess, Tom continued his flirtation with Amy, but only after he had checked to see if Becky was still watching. When he looked across the schoolyard, he saw something else that made his blood boil. Becky was sitting cozily on a little bench looking at a picture book with Alfred Temple. They were so absorbed that their hands and heads were almost touching. Jealousy ran red hot through Tom's veins. He began to hate himself for throwing away the chance Becky had offered for making up. By noon, Tom couldn't take it any longer, and he left school and ran home. So this is what Tom sees across the playground. Oh my, these two are always going back and forth about whether they like each other or not, aren't they? Once Becky saw that Tom was no longer around, she lost all interest in Alfred and the picture book, and she burst into tears. She got up and she walked away. Alfred ran after her, trying to comfort her, but she snapped, "Oh, go away and leave me alone, can't you? I hate you." Well, Alfred stopped in amazement and wondered what he could have done. He was humiliated and angry once he figured out the truth. Becky had simply used him to make Tom jealous, and he was going to get back at Tom. The question was, how? Then he thought of the perfect way to do it. So here's where she is storming off and telling poor Alfred she can't stand him. He went inside the classroom and found Tom's spelling book on his desk. He opened to the lesson for the afternoon and poured ink all over the page. Now remember, back then, they would dip in ink and write. They didn't have mechanical pencils like you do, or ink pens, that kind of thing. And so they had little bottles of ink, and Alfred has just poured it all over Tom's spelling book. At that moment, Becky was glancing through a window behind him. She saw the whole thing, but she moved on and said nothing. So Becky started on her way home, intending to find Tom and let him know what had happened. She hoped that Tom would be thankful that all their troubles would be over forever. But before she was halfway home, she changed her mind. She thought back to the way Tom had treated her, and she was filled with anger. Let Tom get punished for the spoiled spelling book, she decided, and she also decided she was going to hate him forever. And that's the end of chapter 10. Next time we'll be doing 11 and 12.